The name of photographer Cecil Beaton is synonymous with glamour and high society. He was the lover of Greta Garbo, the favourite photographer of the royal family, and darling of Hollywood's elite. His sumptuous portraits flattered his famous subjects. But behind the glitz and sparkle, Beaton was often uneasy about the world he portrayed so elegantly.
The visual really guides my life more than anything. I try to develop my intellect, but I know that it's really through my eyes that I work.
This month, the National Portrait Gallery celebrate the centenary of Cecil Beaton's birth with exhibitions of some of his most striking portraits. From the parties of the Roaring Twenties, to civilian hospitals in the Second World War, to the anarchy and indulgence of life with the Rolling Stones, Beaton's work is an unmatched catalogue of the 20th century.
He left us an enormous document of his time, and so much that I've learned today, I've done through looking at his work.
Beaton was an aesthete, he was a dandy, he lived for beauty. That became his career path. Making beautiful images of beautiful people was everything to him. And his notion of beauty wasn't just about flawless features, it was about the beauty of high style, of elegant living. It was the person, it was also the environment.
If it is snobbish to prefer people who are intelligent, amusing, or beautiful, and who use their assets imaginatively, then I am a snob. But I don't like people only because they are well-born or rich, for they're often so dull and mediocre.
There was slightly feline quality about him. You always got the impression that it might be kind of a few claws in a velvet glove.
From 1922 until a week before his death in 1980, Beaton kept and published a series of diaries full of the gaiety of a life lived in high society. But the recent publication of his unexpurgated diaries reveals a more complex Beaton, whose observations on his subjects are often resentful, even pitiless.
I have always loathed the Burtons for their vulgarity, commonness, and crass bad taste. She wanted compliments. She got none. Her breasts, hanging and huge, were like those of a peasant woman suckling her young in Peru. They were seen in their full shape, blotched and mauve. Round her neck was a velvet ribbon with the biggest diamond in the world pinned on it. Her head, a ridiculous mass of diamond necklaces sewn together.
He was afraid of bad taste, and he was afraid of people who were too assertive and bullish, you know. He didn't know how to defend himself with those people.
Image was everything, in a sense, to him and his way of being. Presenting himself as not just a photographer, not just a designer, also a diarist, a multifaceted talent was central to that process of marketing himself, packaging this image of Cecil Beaton.
The creation of the Beaton image began at an astonishingly early age. He was born into a comfortable but ordinary middle-class family in North London.
I had an idyllically happy childhood. I wasn't conscious until later that perhaps there wasn't as much money there as I would like.
A key part of the Beaton myth was his claim to have found his vocation to be a photographer while still an infant.
When I was 3 years old, I used to be allowed to scramble in my mother's large bed and nestle close to her while she sipped an early morning cup of tea and opened her letters. One morning, during this customary treat, my eyes fell on a postcard lying in front of me on the pink silk eiderdown, and the beauty of it caused my heart to leap. The photograph was of Miss Lily Elsie. I started to make a collection of picture postcards of my heroine.
From this moment on, the spell was cast. Lily Elsie, a music hall actress, represented everything about the world of theatre and glamour that he was desperate to be part of.
As he grew up, he realized that his background was not the one that he would have chosen for himself. So therefore he had to burst out of this kind of strange cocoon of middle-class respectability. And photography was his ticket, as it were, out of that world into a more interesting world.
He began taking photographs at home. He would dress his sisters, Nancy and Baba, in elaborate costumes and drag furniture out into the garden to take photographs of them in peculiar poses. Although his mother was the daughter of a blacksmith, Beaton would cast her as a society lady, unashamedly using his pictures of his family dressing-up sessions to promote himself into the upper classes and get his photographs published in society magazines like Tatler. As a young man, he cultivated a dandyish image and at Cambridge threw himself determinedly into a round of balls and soirees. Here he met Stephen Tennant, one of the so-called bright young things. The young, privileged crowd dedicated to a life of playing and partying. Beaton was transfixed.
Stephen Tennant was everything Cecil Beaton wanted to be at that time. He was talented and good-looking, he had wild imagination, he was very rich, he knew absolutely everybody. And he immediately brought him into his set.
It was wonderful because it was the new doors were opening to me. This was something that I'd never known before, and I was thrilled by the fact that certain people would give up their life to aestheticism. I thought it was lots of fun.
Did you go in for the rather more bizarre extremities of this cult, dressing in fancy clothes and so on?
I think I dressed in a rather peculiar garb, yes.
They used to all rush around having treasure hunts, and they would set themselves extraordinary targets like that they were to go and get Lady Colfax's wig must be stolen, games, and always sort of laughter, always talking about themselves the whole time.
The group included the aristocratic sisters Zita and Teresa Jungmann.
Oh yes, that's me there, head to head. Am I lying down? Oh, Teresa, darling, show her. Do you?
Yeah, I know it, don't you?
Yes.
Well, I think we were asked to stay by Stephen. We were told that he would have sort of shepherds and shepherdesses clothes for us. They were all provided by Stephen. Some idea of his. They were all absolutely mad.
Of course, from their point of view, the group of the bright young things, Cecil Beaton, in a sense, was a wonderful toy for them because he could photograph them in extravagant costumes, and off he went.
Beaton was an innovator. His early photographs are strikingly ambitious with their extravagant backgrounds and bizarre poses. One of his closest friends among the bright young things was the one he would affectionately call his graceful scarecrow.
Edith Sitwell is the exact example of the English eccentricity to me, you know. She's not a beautiful woman, but she's so eccentric and so personal and individual that she becomes more than beauty can be in a way.
Now yourself, Cecil Beaton, as a photographer, you have made some remarkably fine portraits of Dame Edith, as indeed we can see from this one. How does she react as a model?
Oh, she's much better than any model. I must say, when she first stepped to me, I was in the middle of my most exaggerated experimental phase. But Edith was game for any trick and entered with eclat into the most exaggerated nonsenses.
Doesn't the famous tomb photograph belong to this period?
I think it does, yes. I mean, this made a great stir when it appeared, but all of Edith's pictures necessarily make a great stir, because she's the most wonderful, exotic subject that I've ever taken, and I hope to go on taking more and more pictures for many years to come.
At the beginning, I think he was very elaborate on, you know, it wasn't so much about the sitter, it was about the world that the sitter belonged in. And so there was a lot of attention paid to the sets, to the props, and to the way they were lit.
He learnt how to create wonderful, dreamlike theatrical environments around his sitters, and he would create these illusionistic spaces using reflective surfaces, silver paper, cellophane, theatrical devices to create a sense of play and artifice.
Such flattering artifice was not confined to the backgrounds of his photographs. Beaton was happy to manipulate his subjects' appearances into an ideal image of beauty.
He did a hell of a lot of work on the contact prints. He'd virtually kind of redraw them. The printers played a big part in Cecil's output. Bosoms were hacked off, noses were straightened, you know, moustaches were eliminated. It was why he was so popular with grand society ladies with kind of, you know, shelf bosoms, because they came out looking like sylphs.
If you see a perfectly straightforward photograph of a perfectly young and beautiful woman, there are certain things that are objectionable and have to be done away with.
But I'm always true to you, darling, in my fashion. Yes, I'm always true to you, darling, in my way.
The Beaton touch led to demands for his work in New York and Hollywood. He redefined the style of fashion photographs with his flamboyant use of backgrounds and light, and revolutionized the way that movie stars were photographed.
What Beaton brought to his sort of, for want of a better expression, Hollywood portraiture, is he had a great propensity for photographing behind the scenes. Photographs, you see the mechanics of the stage, you see the chains coming down, you see people pulling on ropes, and this use of what one might term real-life props and people in their own surroundings was completely new to Vogue in those days.
Beaton's sexual relationships with both men and women were full of frustration and heartache. His passion for the young aesthete, Peter Watson, was a catalogue of humiliations. His strangest, most tortuous affair was with one of the most difficult, alluring women of the 20th century, Greta Garbo. She hated the glare of celebrity and having her photograph taken, but for Beaton, she relented.
She's the most difficult subject because although she's the subject that one wants to photograph more than anybody, I mean, she is the most perfect model. There isn't a photographic angle that is wrong. She is the one person who just does not want to be photographed. So it's all done against her will. And it's like trying to photograph a butterfly. She's so elusive. And it's a mixture of pain and pleasure.
And he conceives this crazy idea that he wants to marry her, and that would have been a complete disaster. But they definitely did have quite a long affair, really, in some ways, and it's not perhaps to say that they were pursuing the same ideals. I mean, I think for him it was part of that kind of obsession to get the start, and which would make his whole life, and upon getting her, every kind of candle on the celestial altar lit simultaneously. For Garbo it was rather different. I mean, she took a rather more pragmatic view of sex, which was, you know, sex is good for the skin, and if she needed, her skin wasn't looking too good, then some sex was required.
When he met Garbo again years later, his observations in his diary were characteristically clinical and precise.
The surprised profile turned to reveal a big smile. It was almost the same, and yet no. The 2 intervening years since we've last met have created havoc. I was appalled how destroyed her skin has become, covered with wrinkles, double chin. But worse, the upper lip has jagged lower, and the skin has perished into little lines. and there is a furriness that is disastrous.
With success came an overconfidence that Beaton himself was aware of.
There is a devil lurking in me which longs to flaunt danger. This devil must not be encouraged.
In 1938, the devil escaped to turn his world upside down and leave his career in America in ruins. In the corner of an illustration on the New York Society page of Vogue, he repeatedly wrote the word kike, a derogatory term for Jew, and directed towards the Jewish owners of Hollywood studios.
Condé Nast, who owned Vogue, was absolutely incensed and had to pulp, I think, 130,000 copies. And in the end, Condé Nast said to him, as radio stations were talking about it, it was in the newspapers, that Cecil, you've plunged me into an absolutely terrible crisis, completely at odds with the ethos of my magazine. You have to go.
Beaton himself seemed to have no notion of the seriousness of the affair.
I was baffled. I am not anti-Jewish, and I am violently hostile to Hitler. But if there's any possible explanation, these quotes contained my subconscious momentary irritation at having seen so many bad Hollywood films.
This anti-Semitic gesture led to Beaton's departure from America, and he returned to an England on the brink of war. Now his talents were required for official duty, and he was summoned to Buckingham Palace. With such clients, his social climbing had reached its peak.
He was enchanted by the Queen Mother, and of course she was a photographer's dream. And that great sitting in 1939, where she just appears like the fairy queen, and he banks hydrangeas round, and he puts those kind of, I think the Fragonard painting at the back, and he creates this kind of dream image.
A dream image at just the right time. Beaton's photographs of the royal family helped rally the country in the dark days of war. As an official war photographer, he spent 3 years traveling the world. But Beaton was no photojournalist. His war was a staged war, his photographs as artfully lit and highly composed as ever.
At the center of an immensely long table sat the Prime Minister, with pink bladder wax complexion and a vast cigar freshly affixed in his chin. Fat, white, tapering hands deftly turning through the papers in a vast red leather box at his side. He stared into the camera like some sort of an animal gazing from across the back of its sty.
Cecil was, I think, deeply patriotic. I think that comes out in the war photographs, where he was able to throw out the word, what I call cellophane and artificial flowers and all the camphor of the 30s. And he goes straight into those war photographs, which are, they are beautiful. The one of the child sitting in bed, which I think is so moving.
When Life magazine saw that photograph, they wanted it immediately, and they put it on their front cover. And it was a way that England, in a sense, gave its message to America as to what was happening in this country.
The photograph rehabilitated Beaton's reputation in America. After the war, he found himself once more in demand in Hollywood.
She romps, she squeals with delight, she leaps onto the sofa. She puts the flower's stem in her mouth, puffing on a daisy as though it were a cigarette. It is an artless, impromptu, high-spirited, infectiously gay performance. It will probably end in tears.
I think that the hardest thing that you can do to photograph a person is to get something that the person wants to give you that they don't want to give or won't give maybe anybody else. In the Marilyn pictures, he didn't really portray her as the sexiest person, but he captured something from the inside, like, I don't know if it's a melancholy or a certain sadness mixed in with her voluptuousness and her sexiness that she herself had.
Beaton was now exactly where he had always wanted to be, on the crest, as he put it, and he worked hard to stay there. When Hollywood director Vincente Minnelli wanted to create a world of decadence and excess for his musical Gigi, it was Beaton he sent for.
He's the only set designer and costume designer I have ever worked with who was there from morning to night, looking at every detail and photographing as much as he could, recording everything. His conscientious attitude was remarkable. Cecil was extremely collaborative. For instance, he proposed the sketch for the Maxime's white dress. And I saw it, I exclaimed, "Oh, what a wonderful idea, those blackbirds." And he said, "Blackbirds? Those were meant to be ribbons, but if you want blackbirds, that's fine." And so we had blackbirds.
In 1964, he won 2 Oscars for set and costume designs for the film My Fair Lady, the Pygmalion story of an ordinary girl transformed into a society dazzler, that in many ways mirrored his own social metamorphosis.
I could have danced all night, I could have danced all night, and still have baked all night.
One of Cecil Beaton's greatest excitements about doing the film of My Fair Lady was the presence in that film of Audrey Hepburn, who he had photographed in the early 50s. And he was very excited to be able to dress her, because he knew that she was normally dressed by Givenchy. And for 2 whole days, he was allowed by the studio to have her to be photographed in virtually every single extra's costume from the Ascot scene.
I did do several days of photographs in all those divine costumes. They really are like paintings, they're so beautiful. But he was very tender with me, very sweet to me. I really did love him. I mean, I'm not gushing when I say that, but I really adored him.
Audrey is a new type of beauty. Huge mouth, flat Mongolian features, heavily painted eyes, a coconut coiffure, long nails without varnish, a wonderfully lithe figure, a long neck, but perhaps too scraggy.
He was always looking for new people and new forms of talent. So, of course, when it came to the 1960s, he was, of course, fascinated by what a friend of his called the Peacock Revolution, all those kind of amazing characters like the Rolling Stones and wearing kind of purple velvet jeans and beads and things like this, and their very chaotic lifestyle he wanted to know about. And because, in a sense, they were a rebel generation, as his generation had been back in the 20s.
Seduced by the excitement of the 60s, he parted with David Hockney, the Rolling Stones, and David Bailey, who revered him as an old master.
He invented himself and reinvented himself decade on decade. His sense of style and his intuition about fashion were such that he was able to evolve with the changing of fashions.
How very different the youth of today. David Hockney arrived. He turned up in his car wearing the thinnest of synthetic or nylon windbreaks over a T-shirt. It staggers me how an unprepossessing, even eccentric freak like this can be so at home in the world. He seems to have no hurries, no problems, no fears or anxieties. I'm afraid he left me feeling very sorry for myself.
The Cecil Beaton photo shoot that I remember the best was the one with Twiggy, and she was a tiny little creature, of course. And when he saw her, he said, "Oh, this child is, she's as light as air. We can't possibly photograph her on the ground. She's really like Ariel. She has the sort of lightness of being. We'll have to perch her like Tinkerbell on the furniture." He took Twiggy and worked with her in a modern and immediate sort of way. And I think that many people at the time didn't recognize the fact that he'd actually crystallized the 60s in those photographs.
But while flattered by the adulation he was receiving, Beaton was faced with a simple and, for him, terrible truth. He was getting old.
But certainly I do not have the euphoric joy that such things would have given me at an earlier stage in my life. The fact that I look so awful myself is something that prevents my enjoyment of the publicity angle.
Moments when he looks at himself in the mirror, he can't bear being old, he can't bear being wrinkled, and then he'll meet Garbo and, oh, she's got wrinkles too, and all of that I find terribly sad, that he couldn't come to terms with being old. He couldn't bear it, I suppose because the whole of his life was surface beauty.
In 1935, he had photographed Marlene Dietrich. Seeing her later in life, he cannot suppress his horror at what time has done to her.
A lined neck, and the surgeon had not been able to cut away some little folds that formed at the corners of the mouth. He had, however, sewn up the mouth to be so tight and small that her days of laughing are over. She has become a kind of mechanical doll, a life-size mannequin.
Now nearing his 70s, Beaton was painfully aware of the fickleness of beauty and of his own mortality. In 1974, he suffered a stroke which left him paralyzed on his right side. Appalled by what had happened to him, he retreated to his country house in Wiltshire.
I had the feeling that he was a very lonely person at that time, and that was very upsetting to imagine that he'd been so much at the hub and the center of society. And he was comforted by his garden and his immediate household staff, but I think he spent many, many days and hours alone.
After a lifetime worshipping style and beauty, Beaton was left with little to comfort him in his final years.
The life he led, I mean, you read those diaries, I mean, why on earth did he go? Always be seduced by those rich and fashionable, and often very vacuous and very uninteresting people. He was a man that didn't, I think, have much complicated intellect. He had a superb observation of surfaces in terms of style, elegance and high glamour, and closed his eye to everything else.
When his constant companion of 17 years, his cat, Timothy, died on the 11th of January in 1980, Beaton was desolate as he faced his solitude.
Timmy had been a great friend. He had his own ways which would not be altered. He liked to sit on this or that chair. He liked the sunny side of the street. Now all was over and Timmy was alone, parted from us, while we were very much alone, parted from him.
Cecil Beaton died a week later, at the age of 76.
The day of his funeral, I went down in the Vogue car, and I remember the terrible piece of artificial grass on the coffin, which you'd have hated. And then there was a whole flowers all the way up, past the church, including, I remember one from Greta Garbo. But it had that feeling, well, a funeral for somebody who has no belief is empty. And it had that feeling, because I didn't know whether he had belief in anything. He was sort of utterly awful and quite wonderful. And, well, like so many interesting people, completely unique.